Why do you feel your parents sent you to school? Anyone, whatever. Why do you think they sent you to school? You go to college and they sent you to college so you can go to a job? Do you have any answers? Just so people are awake before I start talking. Okay, we're up. I think schools. Do I have that? Right, so schools, I think, most of us were sent to school, I think, for two purposes. One is we could be taken out of our parents' hair because they didn't want us around them all the time. But more importantly, I think most parents, whether they're rich or poor or wherever they come from, send kids to school primarily because it's sort of this first stepping stone towards a better life, right? But even if your parent was a neurosurgeon, they would still send you to school because they would inherently believe that that child could do something even cooler than they did. And in a funny way, I think my journey, at least in the education sector, has been one of realizing that schools don't quite do that. Right? Schools occupy this kind of strange role in our lives, where on one hand they're the bastion of hope for everyone involved. Right? They're this wonderful place where we'd all go and then we'd turn out with fundamentally better futures than our parents had. At the same time, I think what schools are also probably the single biggest cause of social disparity in the world. Right? And this is a hard allegation to put on school, but if you really look at the schooling in our country, it's very clearly divided between the schools of the haves and the schools of the have-nots. Where if you are born in a place, and this doesn't even have to do anything have anything to do with your income level. If you're born in a place with a good school, then you fall into the haves. If you're born even extremely wealthy in a place without a good school, you're a have-not. And in many ways, because that compounds into which college you go to, into what job you have, into the person you become, that simple decision on whether or not you go to a school, a good school, will often determine who or what you become. There's like a stunning stat, and this is one of the few studies that the government publishes on their own school system. Close to 40% of the kids who are in class 10 don't go to class 11. Right? So we have about a 40% dropout rate from class 10 to class 11 in India. So this entire notion of upward mobility is rather false. Because while people will have you believe that somehow achieving literacy is a very valuable asset, it's totally useless. Right? Being literate does not guarantee you any shape or form of upward mobility. Many of the kids we work with, their parents drive auto rickshaws. They make about between 10 and 15,000 rupees a month driving an auto rickshaw. If their kid is literate, they're probably still going to drive an auto rickshaw. True upward mobility really comes from them being able to do things which their parents could not, right? And be in careers which lead to earning potential many times over and above what their parents had. So this has been woven into our political rhetoric, into what you've been told. Oh, literacy is really important. Going to school is really important. Primary education is really important. It's all hogwash. Unless that translates into kids really finding careers that mean more than being daily wage laborers or working with, in factory shops, that's not really creating upward mobility, that's creating more servants for us. And by us, I mean people who are of our broad socioeconomic standing. So upward mobility does not come from getting kids like a very basic minor amount of education. It comes really from allowing them to have an education that's of quality. What's that? Why is Spider-Man on the screen? Right? But I think the crux of it, and Anurag can probably talk to this, right? The crux of this is the fact that we've designed a school system where we expect our teachers to be superheroes. We really expect our teachers to be these wonderful, multifaceted people who know a subject really, really well, who can inspire kids, who can deal with their teenage growing pains. Right? There is no profession, even the medical profession, where anyone would be expected to have so many talents at once. Know a subject really well, be incredibly empathetic, be able to deal with 40 people at once and keep them engaged and enthralled and entertained for periods of time. Right? And somehow through the course of it, be able to have millions and millions of these people in millions and millions of classrooms. Because of this notion of wanting teachers to be superheroes, we suddenly end up in a world where when they are superheroes, and many teachers are, you have great education. And in the off chance that they're anything less than Spider-Man, you're in trouble. Our public schools are short about 1 million teachers. That's more than the number of teachers that there are in total in many countries. But our public schools are short 1 million teachers. If you account for the number of teachers who don't show up to school, that probably doubles or triples. So that's what we're dealing with. So our problem is now we need 1 million superheroes. Now go figure out a way to find 1 million superheroes and train them and have them work in your schools for paltry sums of money. So about 4 years ago, I think we started Avanti, and we started, I think, a chapter here fairly soon after that, with a fairly simple hypothesis, right? Most of you are engineers, I think all of you are engineers, and we're sort of rooted in this notion of having a hypothesis, trying to do something, improving it or disproving it. And our hypothesis was rather simple, and this will make sense to most of you, right? You take smart kids who are motivated, you give them access to good teachers, they will succeed. It is a relatively simple hypothesis to make. You tend to believe that this is true, and much of the spending in education is predicated on this fact. Let's get some great kids, put them with good teachers, and everything will be fine. We kind of did that, right? So we said we'll find the smartest kids there are in at that time about 3 major cities. We identified these children. We tested tested them. We blew their minds with testing. But we said, okay, now you are really, really smart and really, really motivated. We created volunteer teams on student campuses. We gave them mentors, and then we enrolled them in the most expensive coaching classes there are in each city. Right? These are grade class 10 students. We said, chalo, you need to prepare to go to the IITs or go to NSIT or go to a good college. We will take you. We can't change your school. We'll put you in an after-school program that's really, really expensive, and people pay a lot of money, hence hopefully very good. And over and above that, we'll give you great mentors. And we really thought this would work. We raised a bunch of money. We won some business plan competitions. We thought this was going to really, really work well. Unfortunately, that didn't quite happen. It's about a year in when we started to look at sort of the data that we were producing, right, for these kids. And these kids were all testing in the top 5 percentile of kids who took our test. So for instance, in Delhi, we would test about 15,000 kids. Right? Between Delhi and Bombay together, we test 15,000 kids and we would pick 30 children. Very, very, very high percentile of public school children. But 6 months in, 8 months in, a year in, all of these kids were in the bottom quartile of their classes. We would put them in these high-end coaching classes. We would test them on national averages. And while they were testing in the top 5 or 10 percentile at the beginning, they were testing in the bottom quartile, most of our children, in about a year. And the question really became, what is it that we were doing that was wrong? Was for some reason, were these mentors like poison that you just put them in touch with mentors and they would start doing badly? Was something wrong with how they were being taught? Was there something wrong with, and this is one of the more depressing things I hear repeatedly in schools. You go to a public school and you ask a school teacher, why do you not teach your children hard things? They say, because inka to dimag hi aisa hai, inko padhna hi nahi sakte. Right? So I had these 3 really terrible hypotheses. Ek to inka dimag hi aisa hai, padh nahi sakte. Because for some reason being born into a lower class means that you can't learn. The second was that, whatever we were doing was fundamentally harmful. Right? And then the third, which in my mind was the least likely hypothesis, was that, all of this teaching was actually harming them. Right? So we constructed an experiment. What people do, right? So we took a school in Pondicherry where we said, okay, we can't get teachers here anyway. Let's take a baseline case, right? In a baseline, if you said I would do nothing, what is do nothing in education? Do nothing in education is give a bunch of kids access to books and you say, khud padh lo. Right? So we took a bunch of kids, we gave them access to all the books we wanted, we gave them testing and we said, khud padh lo. The only catch we introduced was please study in groups of 5 or 6 because we felt intuitively that was a more robust way to study than study by yourself. Right? So we had this one school where we did this, and then we started comparing that school in terms of academic outcomes to the kids' schools, to the program which we had, which is you go to school, you go to coaching, you get mentored, and you see what happens. And in that program, the only assistance that they had was once a week, they had access to tutors or mentors who would come from IIT Madras and work with these children. So this is about 6 months into starting this experiment, right? All of you understand a normal curve? Good. I will not have to explain it then, right? But we started seeing that these kids in Pondicherry who had no teaching were starting to do much better than the kids who were in our traditional classroom program. So you'll notice 2 things, right? One is obviously the average was higher. But I think what was much more interesting here was that they were much more tightly bunched together. One of the things that happens often in classrooms is you start with a normal distribution and then the standard deviation of distribution gets wider and wider, which basically means that that curve gets flatter and flatter and flatter and flatter in time because the kids who are really good keep getting better and better and better and the kids who are really bad keep getting worse and worse and worse, right? And that wasn't happening here. This was rather confounding and confusing to us, right? Because this is what it was saying. It was saying that students studying by themselves were outperforming premium classrooms, and these are the most premium classrooms that we could construct in India. 2 lakh rupees for 2 years. And this is really distressing, right? Because I said, oh, I built this wonderful non-profit that has a lot of traction. At that time, we had like 200 and something student volunteers. We had a lot of money coming in, and we were like, oh, we built this wonderful system which is underperforming, letting kids be by themselves. And I think what was underlying much of this, right, is not surprising to people who've been studying either cognition or education for periods of time. We literally went and started talking to people. I used to live in the US at the time, and we went and started talking to people saying, you guys have been studying cognition, you've been studying learning for a while. Is what we are saying making sense? Like, is this hypothesis making sense? And funnily enough, for most researchers, this hypothesis made perfect sense. Because shockingly, there's very, very little evidence to say that the traditional classroom, where we do much of what I am doing right now to you, which is someone stands up on stage and lectures you, is effective at all. Very, very little evidence. This is a study that was done recently, and this is not the most robust study on this, but often the most, I find the most illustrative. Right? This is MIT. This is an full undergraduate class, and they fitted them with electrodermal sensors. Right? But what these are, in many ways, a measure of arousal. I don't know if any of you took a psychology course, but there's often a variety of devices that measure how aroused you are. Right? I can hear sniggering because that word is strange. This is basically day 1 to day 4 of a week, and you can see segments for classroom, for TV, for a variety of things. The first thing I want you to all pay attention to is class, right? The yellow, which the pointer is, but the yellow bars. You see class at a variety of places. You'll notice that the level of arousal is basically flat. Right? Then look at TV. Also flat. Okay. Look at sleep. Okay. Look at lab, look at homework. Okay. So, I think television this has been well established, has this ability to hypnotize people. Right? As I'm talking to you, because I'm on stage, there's some lights, there's some visual stimuli, you're listening to my voice, many of you will feel very engaged. The odds that you are actually processing much at this point in time or learning anything are pretty low. There's very little correlation between engagement and learning, and many of you have seen in the education space, people have decided that the answer to all education problems is to have 3D flying objects on screen, and somehow that will allow kids to learn. That's all hogwash. There's very little evidence that even says that causes any positive outcome, if anything at all. Creating engagement does not mean people will learn. Often creating too much engagement means people are hypnotized and are not thinking at all. In fact, in this study, they were probably more active in REM when they were sleeping than they are in the classroom. Now again, this is not the most definitive study, but I find it good to illustrate a point. There are more robust studies with hundreds of thousands of kids that show that lecture-based teaching has very, very little outcomes. In fact, the strongest correlation in many classrooms to learning outcomes is what the parents do. Right? We've now gone and designed this ginormous education system with tons and tons of schools, many, many teachers. We measure metrics like teacher training, and find that it has no correlation. It's a scatter plot. If you look at again the government's data, level of teacher training on one axis, student outcomes on the other axis, zero correlation. Teacher attendance on one axis, overall, student performance on the other axis in classes where teachers were attending, very bad correlation. There's some minor correlation, but the R value is really low. Many of the metrics you've designed to measure the system, and the system itself is fundamentally flawed and doesn't work. And yet we continue to pump trillions of dollars into trying to create more of this. Right? Here I have something that doesn't work, let me make more of it, hopefully it will work eventually. This is one of the places where we sort of found that there was actually very relevant research to what we were doing, which was science and math education in the classroom, was at the lab of Professor Eric Mazur at Harvard. So he's the Dean of Applied Physics there, and has the ignominy of teaching the first year physics course to pre-meds every year. Right? For those of you who don't understand who pre-meds are, in the US you have to go to college before you go to medical school. Right? So these guys are not interested in studying physics. They're interested in finishing their credit so they can go to medical school. So he had this wonderful job of every year teaching a classroom full of pre-meds physics. And what Eric found about 2 decades ago was similar to what we were learning now at the time, right? Which was that when he lectured in class and he measured his outcomes against him lecturing in class and he asked the kids, do you think this is useful? Most of them said no. Then the next step he did was start giving them lecture notes, and this must have happened to you. Many professors do this. Where he would say that, if I am going to give you knowledge or information, I want you to spend the 80% of your classroom time engaging with each other on trying to learn this subject matter. It's very similar to how you would do a PhD program, right? Where you come in, you have some baseline knowledge, you're expected to take some prereqs, you're supposed to understand a few things, but the bulk of the onus of learning, because much of what you learn in science is unknown, is on you to figure out. And the professor is there as a guide. Of course, this person has done this 10 times before, they understand where you might get stuck, they might be able to give you reasonable advice, but Eric started to design a classroom that was centered around peer instruction. And what we found was on, again, very, very standardized tests which are done across the US every year, that he could show a 20-30% gain when he didn't teach. And this is a Harvard professor saying, I can produce greater learning outcomes when I don't teach my class. Right? This is our Kanpur center. And I'll let you, I can play this video, otherwise I'll talk through it. I'll skip over it. Okay. But much of how our classroom runs, right, is we have a facilitator. So this is the rough breakup of what our classroom looks like, right? 40% of all your academic time per topic is do your own thing. You have to study by yourself. 50% of it is a learning coach-led peer learning session. I'll talk about that in a second. And only 10% of classroom time is tutor-led. Right? So this is the exact polar opposite of how a traditional classroom is designed. Where more than 80%, 90% of your time will be teacher-led. And they'll say, घर पे homework कर लेना. और अगर आपके पास समय हो तो बस ट्रक में बैठ के वो स्टडी ग्रुप में कुछ आपस में बतिया लीजिएगा. It's exactly the polar opposite of it. So what happens with most of our kids is we give them, access to books. Again, there's a lot of data which says actually reading is much more effective than watching videos. But we give kids a mix of videos and reading materials that they're supposed to do on their own. They do exercises by themselves. They come to class. In class, they spend, per topic about an hour and a half yelling at each other. Right? So if you want to try one, let me just try something. Let's try a question. Okay? I have a metal plate. Okay? There's a metal plate. Everyone understands what a metal plate is? It has a hole in it. Okay? I heat the metal plate. What happens to the size of the hole? Your options are, and I'll give you 3 options. Option 1 is that the hole becomes bigger. Option 2 is that the hole becomes smaller. Option 3 is that the hole stays the same. Size of the hole stays the same. The plate obviously will get bigger, right? I'm heating a plate, the plate will get bigger. Does the hole become bigger, smaller, or stay the same? Okay, so think about it for a minute. Don't discuss yet. Try and think about it yourself. And everyone will have to vote, otherwise I'll come to you and ask. How many of you think, raise your hands, how many of you think the hole will get bigger? How many think it will get smaller? How many think it will remain the same size? It's literally an even split. So now why don't you take a couple of minutes and discuss it with people next to you who gave a different answer. Don't look at them, you can make noise. आंसर मत दो यार, डिस्कस करो. नॉट गोइंग टू हेल्प यू. ठीक है, चलो we'll vote again now. हाँ, I will not tell you the answer. ठीक है, चलो. How many of you now think it will get bigger? We created more confusion. How many think it will get smaller? More people now think it will get smaller. How many think it will stay the same? Okay. So we've shifted, at least shifted the popular opinion from it will get bigger to it will get smaller. I can tell you that that is the wrong answer. Right? But the point of this was not to teach you physics, right? The answer is it will get bigger. The reason it will get bigger is if you imagine that you drew a ring on a piece of, forget that there's a hole, right? Just draw a ring on a metal plate and heat the metal plate. What will happen to the ring? It will get bigger, right? Because the plate will expand uniformly, hence that hole will get bigger. I can email people a more, if you look for this online, you'll find good explanations, right? But the crux with physics, right, and often with chemistry and often with math, is things that you form intuition about are not actually how they happen, right? And if I were to lecture you on thermal expansion now for the same 5 minutes, it's very unlikely any of you would have thought about this. This is one of the things we do in class. It's probably 10 to 15% of the time we spend in class, where we say in each topic that you have to learn, there are going to be some very common misconceptions. You have to discuss them and try and come to some conclusion. Often that conclusion will be wrong, but in the least you've remembered that you've talked about it, right, and you've seen a right answer. The rest of the class is rather simple, where there's very carefully crafted exercises that the kids do together in groups. Sometimes there's project work that they do in groups, and they work through this for much of the week. At the end of the week, there is somebody who comes in who knows something about that subject, but that person is not coming in blind, right? That person comes in saying, on this thermal expansion concept test, 80% of the class got the wrong answer. Please talk a little bit about why that was wrong, right? Or here are the exercises which people struggle with, here are the questions that they struggle with. So you come in very, very often as a tutor. You don't come in as a teacher. You come in and saying, here are the things that you guys struggled with, I'm going to help you work through them. And by doing this, so when this same group of kids who finally took their IIT exam, we found that they were about 2.5 times more likely than the other group to get into IIT. In fact, about 40% of them got into IIT, and 95% of them placed in the top 10% in the country, which they qualified the JEE mains. Now this is as much more credit to the kids than to us, because I really believe much of what we do in classrooms is harmful, not helpful. I think the least we did there was that we were not harmful, and those kids were very smart to start with. But we've since sort of tried that in a variety of settings, and this was in a Navodaya school where the kids are typically of a very, very high starting level. We then tried it in really, really low performing schools in Chennai. These are the municipal schools where kids really do badly. In fact, not more than 10 to 15% of the girls actually go to college. There we were able to bump up that rate from 15% to 95% plus, the college going rate. 65% of them went to engineering school. And much of this has to just do with not with learning the subject matter. Much of this has to do with the fact of a simple fact of belief that if I have to learn something new, I can do it myself, and I don't have to wait for teacher to lecture me before I can start doing it. And then if I am to learn it myself, here are 2 or 3 simple ways in which I can learn something on my own. Right? So what we were finding is, by changing the paradigm from saying that, it's not about teaching knowledge, right? Much of the conventional classroom is about teaching knowledge, teaching you facts and numbers and iska formula kya hota hai, hypothesis kya hota hai, what is the postulate under which you should do this. This is all relevant maybe 10 decades ago or 5 decades ago, where you could not go and find this out on your own. It's not about teaching knowledge. Much of your classroom needs to be about teaching you how to learn, teaching learning. Right? That's what most people struggle with. How do I take a book and start to make sense of it? How do I work with 4 other people to sort of expand my knowledge in a particular subject area? That's probably what those of you who did well in college probably did well because you had learned how to learn, not because you had learned Newton's laws of motion a little bit better than somebody else. Because much of what you learned in college was new. But when you change that paradigm from teaching knowledge to teaching how to learn, you suddenly change your requirements for a teacher. And if you're not teaching knowledge, then you don't need the teacher to know what is being taught. Especially in the sciences, it's very rare for you to find someone who can come in and say with complete credibility, I know physics. I don't know physics. And I worked in computational fluid dynamic research for a number of years. I don't know even that. No one knows anything. Right? I know some things about physics. I know how to do some things. I don't know a subject. Right? So once you remove that requirement, but I do know what 5 things you should do to be able to learn it better. And all of a sudden you don't need a postgraduate degree in physics to be a high school physics teacher. right? All you need to be able to do is work with students, inspire them, which is very important, right? Tell them how they can access information, and then once in a while when they have questions, give them access to people who can answer them. But it really does change, you start to de-link good education from subject expertise in the classroom, right? So all at once I can say, if I have to create a wonderful, like a outstanding science program in a school, my first step is not to go and find 4 outstanding physicists and chemists and mathematicians to come and work in that school. My task then becomes I need to find 4 outstanding people who can be great coaches for kids who are learning in that school, and they may not know the most amount of physics, chemistry, or math. And all at once you can start to move from a paradigm where you once wanted like a superhero in the classroom to one where you just need coaches. Right? The student can far exceed, and this happens in classrooms every day, far exceed the ability, competence, and knowledge of the person who is their coach or their teacher. And if you start to think of learning as almost like you think of sports, the best coaches are not people who play the sport the best. In fact, it's often the contrary. The best coaches are people who know how to tell a sports person, this is how you get the most out of your body. Right? And if you start to change the paradigm from having superheroes in classrooms to having exceptionally good coaches, all at once filling this chasm of 1 million teachers becomes a lot easier. Because you're going out and your job description no longer says, be Spider-Man. It says you need to be good with kids, you need to be empathetic, you need to be able to work with them and inspire them and teach them a few specific techniques on how to learn information, process information, work together, push their knowledge. And then for instead of 1 to 30 kids, 1 to 500 kids that needs to be our ratio of subject experts to teach to students. Right? It has huge implications on cost. Right? Today we deliver an IIT coaching program or work with schools for about 1/10 the cost of coaching. Right? We can still deliver it at 1/10 the cost and our outcomes continue to be better. You start to but the moment you do all of this, you're no longer stuck to some superstar teacher who's coming and teaching and then disappearing. You can create systems, you can create processes, much of this is replicable, and you start to create a fundamentally new format of education. And I think, before I finish, we work with a variety of public schools across the country now. We just started working with the Haryana government. I talked about these, but before I sort of finish, I think I want you all to sort of think back. All of you raised your hands and you said you went to school. This was great. I want you all to think back to sort of your favorite teacher throughout schooling. Right? All of you would have had like one teacher, and I have, and it's almost impossible that you went through 13, and I'm very sad for you if that happened. But if you went through, during the 13 years of schooling, you may have had, a basketball teacher or a kindergarten teacher who you really cared about, who you thought could, really inspire you. And I think we're starting to move towards a world where that one teacher who you really cared about could potentially take you through your entire 12 years of schooling. Right? You wouldn't have to sort of change classrooms and have new teachers come in all the time. That same person who knew you well, who could get the best out of you, could be your coach, your learning coach for 12 years of your education. With help from people, but that could be a constant presence in your life, just like your parents were. And then I'm almost certain you start to see strong correlation between the amount of input we put into classrooms and the outcomes we see. That's my spiel. Thank you.